Evening, everybody. It's great to see you all tonight, and welcome to the Toronto book launch of Graeme Krupinski's premiere novel, Puerto Montt. This was recently published by Crow's Nest Books, and let's just start off being warm and fuzzy by saying congratulations, Graeme, and maybe a warm My name is Tanner Release, and I'm one of the co-organizers of tonight's event. Graeme Krupinski was born and raised in Toronto before living in Argentina and Chile. Graeme's poetry and nonfiction has been published in journals and newspapers in English and Spanish, and Puerto Montt is Graeme's first novel. Matt Tracey would only like to be introduced as Graeme's friend, which he is, but that's nice. So tonight, Matt's going to briefly introduce the novel and highlight some points of discussion before Graeme reads for a little bit. So once more, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm going to first introduce a little bit about the book and myself. So my name is Matt Tracey, and I'm not important. I'm here tonight to introduce my friend, Graeme Krupinski, who is perhaps important. I first met Graeme as a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, where we served on the Fundraising and Education Committee. This committee was tasked with organizing events such as trainings, lectures, and parties. It was mostly parties. As members of this committee, we learned that the world has an unrelenting desire for parties. And so I wasn't surprised when Graeme asked me to lead the discussion for his new book, Puerto Montt. It's just another party. Graeme asked me to be tonight's discussant right before I took a trip. During that trip, in Prague, in an attic museum for Franz Kafka, I saw two things of note. The first were Kafka's illustrations. They were of men slouched over office desks, and perhaps self-portraits of his time working for the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute. The second was a report about a workplace injury that Kafka co-authored, which included illustrations of various ways that a hand could be mutilated in a textile equipment. He once wrote to Max Brod, his publisher, "The young girls who are constantly falling down the stairs of porcelain factories with mountains of crockery are enough to give you a headache." There are two Kafkas, an anguished employee and a bureaucrat indifferent to the anguish of employees. His soul split, or as important people would tell you, alienated. Puerto Montt is, among other things, a book about alienation. It's about people who are not important, people who are injured and injured people. It's about people who have turned their backs on a world that's turned its back on them. At times, the story feels crowded, like a party. At other times, it feels as lonely as a fundraising and education committee meeting. We only laugh. Yet, these are only reflections of the same world. The party wouldn't happen without the committee meeting, and the meeting wouldn't happen without the party plan. So let's hear from Graeme.
Does this work? Yeah, okay, cool. I'll try and keep this brief so we can get into the reading. I'm just going to introduce the book quickly and give a little bit of context. So, I wrote the first draft of this book over 2 weeks in March of 2014. In the 4+ years since then, it's changed a lot. At one point, it spread to over 300 pages, and now it's just a slim 99. So, I've also, of course, read it many times since it was first written, and the latest time was earlier today. It contains two main characters, one named Rainer Kinrazip, the other named just D, in two main sections, one set in Chile and one in Argentina. The chapters belonging to the former are marked with X's and the latter with Y's. And yes, as much as there is a story, it revolves around a crime. So I've chosen various sections to read from, and as the book is like non-linear, they won't all fit together, but they're kind of standalone sections to hopefully give everyone a sense of what the book is like. I'll read some of the beginning, some of the middle, and then something to close. So let's begin with a note to the reader, and hopefully that will explain a little bit better. A note on the text. There are many books contained within these covers. The first begins on page 1 and ends with the final upside-down period. The next starts on page 1973, then concludes with this note to the reader. Another you might forge by leaving this book on a bench without reading a single word. So it continues. Each is yours, made through inaction. Further examples of a reader's freedom. Flip through the chapters in any order. Reverse, cut up, or ignore any/all of the text. Take the unmarked sections, presented as greater than or equal to one poems or a series of stolen thoughts lacking citation, and read them as a separate work, leave them interspersed throughout, or discard them entirely. As for the X's and Y's that mark the chapters, it is for you to decide what they represent, if anything at all. Let us hope that, in this way, a little of the original disorder of language may be preserved. Poetry itself is born of sudden uprisings, of misrecognition, of loss. But yes, an image to help explain what we're attempting to say here. You, the reader, open this book and step onto a battlefield. You are armed. Choose your weapon wisely. And an old kieltra, a Chilean term for mutt/street job, accompanies you a few steps behind. There is no one in sight, and soon even the mortar brick structures fade into rolling shadow. You're alone, yet your companion, the dog, is there with you. So you take a step outward, not forward, which is absent without the opposition created by backward, outward, away from the point of inertia, the center, and the dog follows as you cross onto the outskirts of the first page. Apologies, many questions remain unanswered. What was meant to be a simple book, the way flame seemed simple, the way rage seemed simple, has clearly transformed itself along the way. The above should make at least one thing clear. In this work, there is only the illusion of a protagonist, of characters, of events. The true subject of this sentence is and always has been you, dear reader. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Cool. Okay, so we'll continue. This is like from the beginning of the text, so hopefully it kind of gives a sense of how the book begins. X, it smells of shit. Tomorrow, certainly such freedom as is possible today is a wretched business. Kafka. When I left without any motivation, without explanation, visceral or otherwise. I wasn't eating very much at the time, or sleeping for that matter. Subsisting on coffee and cigarettes is a good enough reason to do any number of stupid things, she told me. The German student sat between us drinking a beer. He was from Munich. Something about his dad. He didn't speak Spanish too well. She'd lived in Ecuador, and we were speaking of the various pasts that haunted us still. But that comes with the territory. His age, 26. Her age, 28. The year, irrelevant. What shall we do tomorrow? His story smells of shit. Puerto Montt, Puerto Montt. X, the philosopher king. The doors close, in the houses that still have them. You spot collapsing roofs blooming throughout the neighborhood, but that comes with the territory. What are you going to say? Whatever I want to say. Which is? Nothing. Why? I'm afraid. A self-proclaimed philosopher, some professor at the University of Chile, he said, once told me about the time he met Nicanor Parra. They had lunch at Parra's house in the south, or north, depending on one's perspective. Very simple. Cheese, bread, jam, butter, some instant coffee. But we were shaken out of his tail by the shouting on the other side of the room. One of the members of the argument raised their Socialist Party membership card. Muffled news reports echo out of the rusty HVAC system. Every time I see a Social Democrat, I think of Rosa Luxemburg's face the audience hears. So it's all come down to nothing, and of that there's very little left. From there, the whole bar could easily have devolved into various arguments, dominated by the usual ideological insults, but we just left at the back. The law of supply states that, all else being equal, an increase in price results in an increase in supply. The law of demand states that, all else being equal, an increase in price results in a decrease of demand. And what about the central statement of each law, implying a causal, empirical link between two distinct states? I take back everything I've said. Why? Someone's knocking at my door. I've lived without true silence for some time. Outside myself there's quiet. My apartment is removed from the big streets, from the stores and street vendors, from most bus routes even, if I still hear the occasional 19 bus go by. But internally, in my mind that is, there's so much noise. The question remains, what is to be done? There's my rage, the side that would have me be strong, not flinch, the side that is fueled by deep hatred of something that even that half of me cannot name. And then there's my weakness, my insecurity, my fear. This latter self, with its anxieties, its losses, is quite ineffective. It has a very difficult time getting anything done. And my skin emits its signs like a radio wave in the way I walk, through the slight shaking of my hands, picked up by the passerby, noted for future reference. Rage methodically stalks this weakness, like the moth zapper that patiently, without fuss, throws itself into killing the most harmless of floating insects. And so when I imagine the knock at the door, half of me, cowering, alone, moves to open it as my other half, the hunter, stands outside, sharpening a knife, impatiently pushing the buzzer again and again. But neither wins in the end. They just agree to continue their lonely duel the next day. On a beach this time, maybe. The one thing they share is their love of the sea. Why? Draft 4 of a letter, responsibility. In an earlier draft of this letter, I promised the reader much and gave very little. I said I would tell my story, the story of a terrible crime. I said I would name that crime for you, the crime which defines all things. I implied that once I named this crime for you, once I brought it out into the light, it would reveal the center of all that remains hidden. But I have come through blood and fire, as you know, my friend, to a realization. I am unable to provide you with what I've promised. Recognition, to see something and call it by its true name, is an exercise of power, but more importantly, one of responsibility. And this responsibility is meant to be yours. I cannot shoulder it for you, even if I would like nothing more in the world. Why? The dog always gets her way. Over the years, the Quiltro has grown to hold a certain celebrity status in Chile. On the 200th anniversary of its independence, the country selected a national Quiltro to represent all others at the ceremony. In this case, even dogs are welcome to proportional representation, it would seem. After the fact, a friend told me that this beloved representative took the opportunity to piss on the red carpet. Another example takes us to 2011 or 2012, when the president of the University of Santiago decided that the street dogs had overrun his prestigious campus to such an extent that they now attended classes more than the students, who were on strike most of the time. Being near Estación Central meant there was a nearly limitless supply of Quiltros to come in and take the place of those that were carted away. So the president made a decision and called in the police, who, in a reasonable, organized manner, shot every dog they found on campus. The students' response to this police action was just as systematic. They carefully collected all the bodies of the dead strays and piled them in the president's office. Uproar ensues, the strike continues, and eventually this apocryphal tale fades from the minds of the people. Despite the prominent position these dogs hold in Chilean popular life, only a few extraordinary Quiltros break out of the general masses and force the populace to recognize them as individuals. Our guide through these pages is not one of those. She remains blurred, indistinguishable from her sisters and cousins. Even the reader would not notice if she were taken down a dark alley by the police. But so it goes. Dogs made of ink are no different than humans. The turning of a page can end your time with them. One final note before we depart. The main characters of our film were once asked to describe in detail the market value of these Quiltros in a society such as Chile. We will not delve into their responses here. Certainly the reader can imagine what might have been said. Simply put, their supply certainly exceeds the market's demand for their services, and they do make such a mess. It follows logically that those who most despise our street dogs are upper property classes. Why? The restaurant owner rings more than twice. He arrived at my door on the second day. The first contained a few calls, some messages, a voicemail or two, all ignored by a phone which had, out of compassion for its fellow occupant, unplugged itself. The buzzer by the door rang, the day after the second that is, and though it was meant to function as a means of allowing a visitor to enter the building without requiring the resident to go up and down the stairs each time, the one belonging to my apartment at the time was no more than a doorbell. I opened the window and leaned out to see who was at the door, the old-fashioned way. A moment later, I recognized his silver ponytail, glinting in the sun, matched with white polo shirt, baggy light blue jeans, and sneakers. There he stood, waiting. He always wore the same clothes, not the same items, that is, but the exact same colored shirts, pants, shoes, as if his wardrobe were made up of 15 plus of each piece of clothing. Same brand, same style. Not cheap, of course. They all had the insignia of some company that I didn't recognize, and his glasses, while not flashy, clearly weren't the kind provided by the National Health Service. I saw him and immediately retreated from the window. I unplugged my phone, but it had already done the job itself. Unplugged the shitty computer I had at the time, or was it already broken by then, and sat down on the floor. Out of sight, the buzzer rang a second time, then a third. I lit a cigarette, half lying down now by the window. The buzzer rang a fourth time. He'd been waiting 20 minutes now. I lit another cigarette off the first. The building I lived in had thin walls. There was only one floor with 5 or 6 apartments on it, connected by an outdoor walkway where the rainwater would gather up and leak under the doors. So naturally I could hear the older woman next door talking on the phone. Her buzzer rang next. She opened the door and slowly went down the stairs to the entrance. A few minutes pass. She comes back up and closes her door. The buzzer rings in the next apartment over. No one is home. Then the next apartment. Then the next. He slowly rings the buzzers of every apartment in the building. A few people go down, then come back up. No one lets him in. The scene repeats itself the next day and the day after. At some point, he stops arriving at the door, waiting patiently outside, slowly ringing the bells of the unknown neighbors. He even stops calling my phone. I think of an old song that another character used to sing to himself as he walked. The money that they gave you, they said it was mighty fine, but they'll give you $50 and then take back $49. X, draft 1 of a letter, the eternities between the many and the few. Oh, infinite egoism of adolescence and studious optimism. How full of flowers was the world that summer, melodies and forms dying. Hello, my name is D. I have black hair, brown eyes, and lack employment. Enough with the fucking introductions. I'm here to inform you that this book in your hands is a detective story, a search through space and time with the intention of finding the solution to an ambiguous mystery. This book in your hands is the tale of my hunt for the truth hidden behind the shadow, of my wanderings through the labyrinth of temporal sentence and memory, unafraid of the ghosts. I, named yet nameless, will recount this story to you. This story, my story, of a terrible crime. Thank you.
Give it up for Graeme one more time. So, the way we've decided to structure it is last weekend we kind of got together and chatted about the book, and we were getting very excited, and we decided we would just selfishly take 10 minutes to recreate that description, and you can be here for it. So we kind of jotted down some ideas we wanted to sort of talk about, and then after the 10 minutes we'll open it up for Q&A. But just to begin with, like, walking here today, I was kind of thinking about the book, and I realized I've been thinking about the book all week, and that it's such sort of a composition of like shattered glass in some ways, and that like every angle is a little bit different, and like I keep thinking over the same things, and as you were reading, I kept thinking over the same things, and thinking like, I didn't even like put those two together, and in part that's because you can read it in so many different orders, and anyway, just something I was thinking about. Now to the scripted section. So to begin with, you know, we kind of talk about, there's two main characters in this book. There's K and there's D. Both find themselves pretty isolated. Phones unplugging themselves, and computers smashed or not smashed. And they have precarious statuses in the world as workers, as refugees in some ways, as victims. So can you talk a little bit about alienation and why that theme sort of attracted you to this book?
I mean, I guess I'll start by talking a little bit about the characters. So, like, K and D are the only two real characters in the book, I guess. Other people come and go, but they're kind of more like ghosts. They're never fully filled out. They're in forms. They come and they like play a role and then depart, and no one knows where they came from or where they went. So, like, the story really the book really focuses around the mental states of both K and D. And so if we're talking about alienation, on like the one hand, there's the fact that like, especially K in the latter half in Argentina, like he meticulously notes down like the daily tasks that he has to work in a like that he does at his work in a restaurant, like the breakdown, the number of plates that he drives, the minute by minute descriptions of like his day-to-day life at that restaurant. And so there's like that form of alienation, especially present in his story of like from his labor. But then like the book is probably more focused on like the alienation and isolation they feel in like an existential or even like in their psyches, like the separation that they feel from other people around them, and the way like Kay talks about that at one point, how like he spent too much time speaking a second language that isn't his own, and so like he doesn't even know like which voice in his head is his and which isn't, and he's like trying to be sincere admitting this. But D also struggles with these things, and like for different reasons, for like being displaced from childhood and things like that. But basically it's like they feel isolated and separated from the world, and like Matt, like you said in the beginning, Matt, like the world has turned its back on them, so they turn their backs to the world like as a means of protecting themselves. And I guess this is like, why did I write about this and why is it of interest to me? Because like when people are under intense stress or pressure, this is like, it kind of makes them split like this into like these dual selves frequently. And I'm like the stress that it puts on people and the way that it drives them away from any like idea of like community or like people around them is like, I'm very interested in why and how that happens and exploring that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we kind of talked about how mental health and sort of psychological distress play out. And I mean, from my work, I work in psychiatry, not as a psychiatrist, but I mean, it's kind of the same thing. It's like there was that, I jotted down the sort of when being on both sides of the door is like both crouched on one side and then the aggressive hunter on the other side is definitely it's this thing that plays out, and where you are both your worst enemy and it's sort of you're seeking help internally and cannot find it from yourself. It's very interesting. All right, so another thing, and this kind of leads into the next part, sort of a solitary figure. There's a couple times, especially towards the end of the book, where Brecht himself is voiced through the book and speaks about footloose vagabonds and proletarian fighters, and it's their role as both models and as sort of in ideology, but also in literature. Can you talk or expand on those sort of terms and why they're important?
So that part of the book is like lifted word for word from conversations that Brecht had like in real life, and that specific part where he's referring to Rimbaud as this kind of figure who's famously turns his back on society, and he's saying that how he thinks there's no way that could be a model representation of a proletarian fighter. And I just thought it was hilarious. I always thought that part was hilarious, that Brecht seemed to have like worked so hard to come to this conclusion when it's like, yeah, like turning your back on society to become a gun runner is probably not model behavior no matter what. I do like Brecht, but I also think that he's very serious. But so maybe to answer that question a little bit better, so there's like this stereotypical kind of quixotic figure in many books, or like it's like a motif in literature, this kind of figure that attempts to like turn their back on society to like because of all the wrongs that they see and like do something. Like in the past it would have been pure or like for some like grand narrative in the 19th century, and in the 20th century it's like frequently like trying to figure out what to make of everything by turning their backs precisely on it so you can have space from it. But so they talk about this because Brecht and Kinrazib K are having this conversation, and Brecht shares his perspective, which I already kind of made fun of, but and Kay's response is just to ask him if he's heard this song. So
What's the song?
it's a Victor Jara song called Brilliantes por Puerto Montt.
And that kind of, I mean, all the questions lead into it because this was scripted, but that nicely leads into the next question. Conversations with poets. Like, I felt as I was reading the book a little bit like Dante, maybe with Virgil guiding me through hell, or maybe with the sort of virtuous pagans in limbo. Either way, there's a lot of poets in this, and like people speaking in this book. So why sort of give them voice directly? Why choose to use them as characters directly in the narrative?
There's various reasons for that. Like, I think that part of what I'm trying to do in the book is like by invoking other texts and other works. The book is obviously very thin, and it's like even pared down. It doesn't focus a lot of time on like filling out setting or discussing like how people get to where they are or any of these. It's all in like even a lot of the plot happens like off stage. And so these kind of references and like citations, as well as like there's other like historical points within it, kind of allow it to build a setting very quickly by like placing it within both like a literary context and a historical context, as well as like geographical, I guess. But so that's part of it. And it's also, I think, like, because the book and the characters are so interested in reading and literature, they are like constantly having discussions about it, having discussions about like their constant question is like, what is to be done? It's just obviously the question that has been asked before, but they're like mean that in many ways, and so they're constantly trying to figure out like how does their liking reading or literature fit in with like everything else that is going on. Like, is it like if they turn their backs on society and read books in a room by themselves, it's like that's not helpful, but like what else can they do? And so like they begin to sketch out a kind of like loose criticism in the sense of like what works they feel like have been forgotten that should be lifted up, and what works that have been like oversold in the history of the world. And like there's a section where Via Snape all gets made fun of, but so that's multiple reasons.
And that includes the scripted portion of tonight. So what we're going to do now is open it up to the floor for questions. If there's a lot at once, I'll probably take them in threes, and if there's just a few at a time, we'll do it one-on-one. So are there any questions for Graeme?
Okay, Puerto Montt is a city in southern Chile. It is an old port city that was very famous for some time before a new city popped up beside it that became very fancy because it has a nice lake. And so Puerto Montt's kind of like a rundown port town in the south. And so anyways, the song, Brilliantes por Puerto Montt, is an old song from the 70s or 60s. I think it's from 68. When it's like basically, it's by this Chilean singer, and it's like a rebuttal, angry like call to arms against the interior minister who sent the army in and like killed all these people there in 1967 or 8 or whatever. I think if there is a purpose to the book, which I don't know if there is, but it's like attempting to explore and understand like this kind of mental state that these characters are in, and like it's focused far less on like the plot than many other books might be, and much more on like the internal settings of their minds. So I think that if anything, like the way that they deal well or not well with like the consequences of things that they have no control over is like the most important thing to take from it. Like to like see the ways in which people can be broken down either by the world around them or like by their own actions, but like not really in the sense of free will, like having no choice but to make those actions, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I don't know exactly how my time in Chile would like in relation to the student strike and all of that stuff, would have impacted like my creativity per se, but like I couldn't say that like things that became urgent to me became urgent because I was living there probably, and if I had been living here maybe other things would have become urgent, and it's hard like for me to know exactly how that changed because I don't know, I only have one past, not the multiple possible ones, but other than that, like how we're trapped by our past and how we could move towards a better future, like I don't have a concrete answer for that necessarily. Like I think that a lot of it means addressing the issues like facing all of the things that have led to this moment and then attempting to like work through them together. But and like if we're talking about it in like a book sense, like how the characters attempt to overcome their past, it's the book may actually, I mean, it depends on how you read it, but like it comes to a point at the end where it seems like it's like come to a head, and either they'll figure out a way somehow, like by chance or by sheer force, to like overcome all of these issues and stuff, or they just never will, and it will just end. So like the book end, like depends on how you read it, like what you take away from it. It ends like they're just there still.
And this is one we kind of ended our conversation last week on, and we kind of just came up with no answer. Is this an anti-capitalist book?
Do you want me to say what I said?
Well, like less profanity.
I mean, I think that, and this is what I said to Matt before, is that it's a neoliberal book in the sense that all of the context, social context, all of the like logic of the text is rooted in neoliberalism, in the sense that it is like everything, all of the characters' nightmares and everything is all based in this kind of individual isolating logic of not anti-capitalism but neoliberalism. And in that way, it's not like a dream of a better world, but like a nightmare of this one, if that makes sense.
So, thank you so much for Graeme for reading. Can we give him another round of applause?